The idea that consuming wisdom is just as dangerous as ignorance if you lack the discernment to process it forms the core of a biting satirical tradition in Urdu literature. We see this perfectly captured in the figure of Hakim Batli Bambis, a fictional sage whose very name suggests a blend of the absurd and the profound. The specific quote about the doctor recommending walnuts is not just a joke about a digestive mishap, it's a sophisticated critique of how greed, overconfidence, and a superiority complex can lead a person to swallow information whole without ever actually understanding it.
It's a brilliant metaphor because the walnut is historically and culturally the universal symbol for the brain. In many traditions, from ancient Greece to the Mughal courts, the physical resemblance between the walnut meat and the human cortex led people to believe it was literally brain food. So when the doctor in this anecdote says walnuts are good for you, he is offering a fundamental truth. He's providing the brain or the intellect. The tragedy, or the comedy in this case, is that the patient doesn't distinguish between the nourishment, the wisdom, and the protective shell, the rigid, indigestible exterior.
And that lack of distinction is where we see the first psychological pillar, ignorance. But it's a specific kind of ignorance. It's the ignorance that masquerades as compliance. The person thinks they're being a good student or a good patient by doing exactly what the expert said, but they've missed the internal logic of the advice. If you eat the shell, you aren't just failing to get the nutrient, you're actively hurting yourself with the very thing that was meant to help you. It turns the medicine into a weapon.
That's exactly where the greed comes in. In this context, greed isn't necessarily about money. It's an intellectual greed. It's the desire to consume as much wisdom or wellness as quickly as possible. Instead of carefully cracking one walnut and contemplating its value, the person in the quote tries to eat 5 or 6. They want the maximum benefit with the minimum effort of preparation. They're trying to hoard the benefits of health without doing the labor of understanding how the benefit is actually delivered. In Urdu satire, this often mirrors how people consume religious or philosophical teachings. They memorize the shell, the outward form, and ignore the kernel, the spiritual essence.
The quote then moves into this fascinating territory of overconfidence. The patient doesn't stop to ask, wait, how do I eat these? They assume their own intuition is sufficient. There's a certain arrogance in thinking that once you've been given a piece of high-level advice, you automatically know how to implement it. It's the classic Dunning-Kruger effect in a satirical medical setting. They have just enough knowledge to be dangerous, but not enough to be safe.
Which leads directly into the superiority complex mentioned in the prompt. There's a hidden layer here where the person might think they've found a shortcut. By eating the whole thing, they might feel they are being more thorough or more hardcore than the average person who just eats the nut. They take the doctor's advice and try to outdo it. It's an ego-driven interpretation. They aren't just following the advice, they're trying to master it in a way that makes them feel superior to the simple process of cracking and peeling. They want the whole truth, quite literally, and it's that very desire for total, unrefined consumption that leads to their downfall.
When we look at the name Hakim Batli Bambis, it reinforces this. A Hakim is a traditional physician or a wise man, but Batli is a bottle, and Bambis refers to bamboo. It's a caricature of authority. It suggests someone who is hollow like bamboo, or perhaps filled with something unexpected like a bottle. This satirical figure serves as a mirror. When the patient suffers from eating the shells, the quote asks, "What is the doctor's fault?" This shifts the blame from the provider of truth to the consumer of truth.
This is a profound shift in responsibility. In modern education, or even in media, we often blame the doctor or the teacher if the information doesn't land correctly. But this Hakim is saying that truth is a tool, and tools require skill. If I give you a sharp knife and you cut yourself because you grabbed the blade, is it the knife maker's fault? The shell of the walnut represents the context, the language, and the medium. If you try to digest the medium instead of the message, the resulting stomach ache is a direct result of your own cognitive failure.
It's interesting how this connects to the broader history of Urdu zarafat, or humor. Writers like Mushtaq Ahmad Yusufi or Patras Bakari often use these kinds of logical fallacies to expose the absurdities of the middle class. They would take a perfectly reasonable premise like walnuts are healthy and follow a path of wrong-headed logic to a disastrous conclusion. The humor comes from the recognition of that specific type of person who is too proud to ask for instructions and too greedy to wait for the right moment.
And if we break down the technical aspect of this metaphor, it's about the barrier to entry. Every piece of profound wisdom has a barrier, the shell. In academia, that might be complex jargon. In religion, it might be allegory. The shell is there for a reason. It protects the meat from rotting. If the meat were exposed all the time, it wouldn't be valuable. The superiority complex makes a person think they can bypass the barrier. They think the barrier is an annoyance rather than a necessary part of the organism. By ignoring the barrier, they destroy their ability to actually gain the benefit.
There's also a cultural impact here in how we view experts. The quote highlights a disconnect between expert advice and public application. The doctor gives a general truth, but the individual applies it without common sense. It's a warning against blind following. In the era of the internet, where we have Hakeem Botley Bambus figures all over social media giving 30-second advice on complex topics, this is more relevant than ever. People are eating the shells of health tips, financial advice, and political theory every single day.
Exactly. Think about hustle culture or biohacking. You see a headline that says cold showers increase focus. The greed and overconfidence response is to stay in an ice bath for 3 hours and then blame the person who wrote the article when you get hypothermia. The lack of nuance is the shell. We want the result without the process of calibration. The walnut metaphor is perfect because it's a natural physical representation of the core versus crust problem.
I want to push back on the superiority complex part, though. Could it be that the patient isn't feeling superior, but is actually just terrified of appearing ignorant? Maybe they eat the shells because they don't want to admit to the doctor that they don't know how to eat a walnut. They want to appear like they are already in the know.
That's a very nuanced interpretation. It's the superiority complex as a defense mechanism for an inferiority complex. They pretend to be super consumers of wisdom to hide the fact that they don't even have the basic tools to crack the nut. But the result is the same. Whether it's driven by ego or by fear, the outcome is a self-inflicted wound. The doctor's advice remains true, but the patient's execution turns it into a poison.
This reminds me of the idols of the tribe that Francis Bacon talked about, the inherent biases of human nature. One of those biases is the tendency to oversimplify or to see patterns where there are none. We see the pattern walnut equals good, so we conclude more walnut equals more good, and all parts of walnut equals good. It's a failure of categorization. We fail to categorize the shell as waste or container and the meat as content. That is the fundamental intellectual failure of the greed, ignorance, overconfidence triad.
And the irony is that the shell is the most visible part. It's what you see first. People who are obsessed with superiority and status often focus on the shell, the degrees, the titles, the outward vocabulary, because it's the most impressive looking part. The meat inside is small, wrinkled, and hidden. It requires work to get to. The person in our quote is essentially saying, I want the part that looks significant, and they end up choking on it. It's a commentary on the superficiality of intellectual pursuit.
So if we were to translate this into a modern takeaway, it's that the value of information is 10% the data itself and 90% the how of its application. The how is the nutcracker. Without the nutcracker of critical thinking, even the best advice from the best Hakeem is just a hard object that's going to cause you pain. The doctor has no fault because the doctor assumes the patient has the basic equipment of a human being, the ability to think and discriminate.
That's the big idea. We live in an information-rich world where the doctors are everywhere, but the stomach aches are increasing because we've lost the art of cracking the nut. We've replaced discernment with volume. We think that by consuming more shells, we are becoming more enlightened, when in reality, we are just becoming more burdened. The wisdom of Hakeem Botley Bambus, though wrapped in a joke, is actually a very serious plea for slow, deliberate, and discriminatory learning.
It's a plea to respect the barrier between the source and the self. To understand that not everything provided to us is meant for immediate, total absorption. Some things are meant to be discarded, some are meant to be peeled, and only a tiny portion is meant to be integrated into our being. The greed to take it all in at once is the fastest way to ensure you get nothing from it at all.
And ultimately, it forces us to look in the mirror. When we fail or when a piece of advice doesn't work out, our first instinct is to blame the doctor, the system, the mentor, the book. But the Hakim reminds us that the responsibility of digestion lies solely with the one who eats. If you choose to ignore the shell, you choose the consequence. It's a tough, almost stoic lesson disguised as a piece of South Asian folk humor.
The next time you find yourself quickly consuming life hacks or expert tips without stopping to ask how they actually fit into your reality, remember the man with the 5 walnuts. Before you swallow the whole thing, make sure you've taken the time to discard the shell. Share this episode with someone who enjoys unpeeling the deeper layers of common sense.